The U.S. and the Taliban appear to be making progress toward a peace deal in Afghanistan. Negotiators have agreed on a framework for a potential pact that could finally end the 17-year-long war. American officials say the Taliban has promised to prevent terror groups such as al-Qaeda from creating safe havens in Afghanistan. In exchange, the Taliban is demanding all foreign troops leave the country. CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata joins me now from our London bureau. Charlie, good to see you. You have traveled to Afghanistan and covered the war many times over the years. Both sides of this conflict have tried and failed to come up with a peace plan. What do you think is different this time around?
Over many years. What's different this time around is the fact that they're talking at all, and the fact that there seems to be an impetus from the American side anyway to find some sort of framework. And that term framework is very important here, Don. They seem to be making progress, and the news that was coming out of Doha, which is where these talks are taking place, is that the framework is in place. There's a lot of ifs in that framework. I mean, Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, who's been brought there specifically to try to hammer out some sort of peace deal with the Taliban on behalf of the Trump administration, has reported progress. And that's what we've seen today in the New York Times, saying that the framework is there. But a lot, in his words, needs to be flushed out. And as you said, there are contingencies here. It's contingent on big ifs as to whether the Taliban is going to declare a ceasefire with the Afghan government and the Afghan military. That's a big if, and that hasn't been accomplished yet. And that the Taliban is going to be talking to the Afghan government at all. These talks are taking place between the United States and the Taliban. A very key partner is not involved in those talks, and that's the Afghan government itself.
Complicated issues and a lot of historic pain between the two. Just over the last year, you've reported on frequent Taliban attacks against American and Afghan troops across Afghanistan. Do you think that should make us maybe skeptical about the prospects of a long-term peace agreement?
Yes, Don, you know, when you said that, why does it feel like there's some progress, or why should we have hope? The fact that they are speaking and the fact that so many people want peace, people in the United States, if you think it's been a long war for Americans, imagine what it's been like for Afghans who've lost hundreds of thousands of people in this fight with the Taliban and U.S. forces and other insurgent groups within Afghanistan. So these attacks are ongoing. I went to Nangarhar province just a couple of months ago at the end of last year. This is a place that's been the most dangerous province for U.S. forces, not just because they're being attacked by the Taliban, but they're being attacked by ISIS groups that are in that region as well. And we were told that, and to try to get into these places, you fly into it. When you leave these bases, you're there with these armored vehicles. There's no safe place for U.S. forces to move around there. So the Taliban is constantly on the attack. And just last week, they overran an Afghan military base, an Afghan military compound. Dozens of people, something like 50 people were killed and many more injured. Now, why is that sort of hurry-up offense taking place now? Well, the Taliban is doing what might be described as a land grab. They want to be able to negotiate from a position of power. So while this, I use the word peace deal loosely, while this peace deal is being hammered out, they're trying to do as much as they can to be able to negotiate from a position of power, not just in terms of territorial gains, but in terms of influence within Afghanistan itself. And they're not going to give that up. So it's very contingent on the fact that, and these are big ifs, whether or not the Taliban is going to agree to a ceasefire deal with the Afghan government, who they are not talking to, or whether they will even negotiate with the Afghan government themselves, who are just seen by the Taliban as puppets.
Yeah. You know, this, as we said, this is our longest war, but it's not difficult to remember what life was like in Afghanistan before this war. Under the rule of the Taliban, girls could not go to school. Historical monuments were blown up, priceless monuments, artwork destroyed. Do you have a sense of how the Afghan government would feel about having the American forces leave their country and actually have the Taliban at least sharing power, if not taking over completely eventually?
Well, I mean, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani said just a couple of days ago, well, actually, no, he said today, he went onto national television because, of course, many people are talking about the news that's coming out, saying we've lost 45,000 Afghan forces to the Taliban. We remember what it was like under the Taliban. Women who have had these tremendous freedoms since the Taliban was overthrown have been able to go to university. They've been able to hold positions in parliament. They're already expressing fears that, wait a minute, we don't even have a female negotiator at those talks. How can we be sure that if there is going to be an interim government or an inclusive government that includes the Taliban, that we're suddenly going to have an enlightened Taliban, a Taliban 2.0, who's going to look at the advances that have been made, even slight advances in certain situations when it comes to security, but in terms of freedoms, we all remember some of us remember what it was like under the Taliban, and nobody wants to see a return to Taliban rule, even if it just means that they're going to have influence within the Afghan government.
Very interesting. We have such a long history in Afghanistan and a history of abandoning them, and then bad things happen. Charlie Daggett, I know you're going to keep an eye on this. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Don.